Alright.
Okay. Cool. Okay.
Trimbo, welcome to our podcast where you will be learnt a thing or two.
From Shakespeare,
Othello.
Sully, and Bales.
Is that his name? Oh no, Sully and okay, I get it, never mind.
Welcome to Sully and Bales podcast.
I love it. Anyway, just before we start.
Today we'll be talking about Othello, the Black Rat, and this play.
Alright.
Cool. Good evening, strumpets and cuckolds. The role of women in society and how they are viewed has vastly evolved between the times of Shakespeare and today. In Shakespeare's play Othello, women are bound to the standards of the set Elizabethan era, that essentially being that they are the property of men. Two examples of women are portrayed in this text, that being the perfect bride of Othello, Desdemona, and her cynical lady-in-waiting, Emilia. Throughout the play, Emilia's initial reverence to her husband Iago slowly dissipates as she begins to realise his motives and perceive passive manipulation, eventually leading to her usurping his authority and exposing his evil plans to the rest of the characters, despite the societal expectations upon her as a devoted wife.
Emilia's character is first shown to be similar to Desdemona's as the ideal woman in an Elizabethan society that displays beauty and loyalty. Elizabethan women were expected to follow the orders of their husbands. Women were their property, and they were obligated to be complacent at all times. In Act 3, Scene 3, line 295, Emilia says, "What will he do with it? Heaven knows. Not I nothing but to please his fantasy." This takes place as Emilia gives Iago Desdemona's handkerchief. She perceives that his intentions are far from good, but complies regardless, as her only task in life, as she says, is to obey and please him. In line 313, Emilia expresses curiosity and asks Iago what he plans to do with it. But when Iago becomes defensive, he says, "Be not act known on it. I have use for it. Go and leave me." And just as an obedient wife should, Emilia obeys and drops the subject before leaving Iago to his plan. She wants to question his motives, but knows it is not her place to do so, thus she doesn't speak again. This action would have likely pleased an Elizabethan audience, as it depicts the desired values and attitudes of the perfect wife. Emilia clearly reflects the dominant values and attitudes in the Elizabethan context. In a more modern audience, we see this as naive, and we see her as a pushover who can be easily manipulated. These actions persuade us to not see Emilia as the heroine-like character she is, but more like a damsel in distress. Her complacency would be seen as weakness from the perspective of a modern audience. Emilia's character develops further from her compliant and obedient self to a more independent and courageous woman, seeking justice for her friend's murder. In Act 5, Scene 2, line 181, Iago instructs Emilia to stop talking, as he doesn't want her to expose him. Iago says, "Go to, charm your tongue," in which she replies, "I will not charm my tongue, I am bound to speak. My mistress here lies murdered in her bed." Through this dialogue, we see Emilia take a stand against her husband to ensure that Desdemona gets justice for her death. She knows the consequences of this could end up with her in the same position as Desdemona, but she continues to persist.
This would seem very odd for an Elizabethan audience, as they can relate to the ownership Iago has over Emilia and the expectation of blind obedience. But as an evolved society, we can see that Emilia's attempt to overcome her oppression is a perfectly acceptable endeavour. Iago warns her again in line 222 when he says, "Be wise and get yourself home," to which she again shows defiance by replying, "I will not." This second disregard of his authority angers Iago, and he attempts to strike her with his sword.
Not only does Emilia defy her husband's direct orders, but she also stands up against Othello, another man in power. When she finds Desdemona's body, she calls out Othello with little regard to what may happen to her for questioning someone with as much power and authority as him. In line 161, Emilia says, "Thou hast not half the power to do me harm, as I have to be heard. Thou hast done a deed, I care not for thy sword, I will make thee known." By this, Amelia is saying that there's nothing Othello can do to her to stop her from getting justice for her friend. In this section of the script, Amelia doesn't reflect the dominant values and attitudes of her context, but she does fit the values and attitudes of our modern context. Amelia's reluctance to comply in this later stage of the script drastically contrasts to her character in the earlier stages mentioned previously, where she illustrates naive obedience.
Although Amelia's actions very much oppose the attitudes and values towards the relationship between men and women in the Elizabethan era, their alignment with Australia's progressive society is irrefutable. Such ideals are presented by Amelia through a conversation with Desdemona, an ideal archetype of the perfect woman according to Elizabethan standards, as they discuss their roles as wives in Act 4. When asked if she would betray her husband in price of the whole world, without hesitation Amelia replied, "Why, who would not make their husband a cuckold to make him a monarch?" This calculating and independent way of thinking was not something common to be seen from women in the 1600s as it is now. She then continues to claim it is her husband's fault if wives do fail, arguing that any misfortune that women are blamed for actually occurs due to their husband's transgressions, painting women in a somewhat pure and innocent light. Living in the 21st century, there is a high prevalence of women exercising positions of power, using their intelligence and skills, equal to the capacity of men in similar roles. This idea of women's ability being equal to men's is also voiced by Amelia. "Let them use us well, else let them know the ills we do. Their ills instruct us so." Such ambition and defiance against the social construct of male superiority is a highly celebrated and endorsed attitude to hold for many women and men in the present, as society has moved beyond the toxic and objective views on females of past tradition. As feminism has become such a positively followed movement, the reception of Amelia's bold and resolute conduct by modern Australians is supported and endorsed.
When the play was performed in its context of production, it is likely that the Elizabethan audience would have seen Amelia's development as a downward change in value. They would likely see Amelia as a radical character for disobeying her husband and perceive her as a symbol of what an ideal woman should not look like. Whereas in our context of reception, we see Amelia as a courageous revolutionary standing up for what she believes in and not allowing herself to be downtrodden by male authority figures. Her independence and bravery are values that we hold in high regards in our society, where women are praised for speaking their minds and not being bullied into submission by males.
You're welcome.
I hope that learnt you a thing or two.